Hello, and welcome back to another tour inside some section of my mind. I am Daniel Thompson. Now, I've talked to you in previous episodes about a few members of my family. However, there is one person that I realize that I don't talk about often. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that I don't think I really knew how to understand or think of this person until after everything I went through last year. That person being my grandfather, Arzell Thompson. Uh, the title of this episode, Flukie, is actually his nickname. That's how he was known. So before I get into kind of how I knew him, just a little bit of background on my grandfather. So my grandfather was a black man. He grew up or was born in Mississippi in 1917, February 1917. He grew up, I believe, in Chickasaw County, Mississippi. And for those who know about how the South was for black people back then, my grandfather did not get much of an education. He never learned to read. That's something that he hid from both my father and I think all of us for a long time. And the interesting thing is that I never realized it. My father had to tell me that my grandfather couldn't read because Arzell was very good at not highlighting his flaws, not in a mischievous or misleading way. It's just he was proud in ways like all of us are. And I don't think he wanted me or my brothers or his children, my father and his brothers, to grow up looking down on him because of what he couldn't do. So, with that background, so my grandfather wasn't very well educated in text, but he got work as I know he was a shoe shiner at some point because I used to have a shoe shine kit in my parents' garage. And he was a chauffeur for a time. In fact, my grandmother, Mary Alice, and my grandfather met in St. Louis, I believe, working for the same white family. My grandmother was the cook and my grandfather was their chauffeur. Now, the dynamic of my family was that my grandfather or my grandmother, Mary Alice, had been married before my grandfather. So there was what split into the Doss side of the family through Mary Alice and her two kids with Mr. Doss, who I can't remember his first name. And then there were the children with my grandfather, Arzell, which is my father, Stan, Jim, and of course, Arzell Jr., who I just call Junior. So my grandfather grew when my grandmother and my grandfather got married. Her children initially, my uncle Louis Doss and Linton, were closer to him in age. So my grandfather was my grandfather on the Thompson side. He was all of our, kind of patriarch. But on the Doss side, he was known as Flukie because he wasn't really related to any of them, but they all embraced him as family. And he treated them like family. It was hard to tell while my grandparents were alive that there was any difference between Dosses or Thompsons, besides the fact that we could look at each other across any room and realize that one of us is one or the other. Very distinct looks. But my grandfather, when my grandparents got married and started having kids of their own, it was Louis, I believe, or one of my uncles that somehow he had heard about, work in the North and that there was actually opportunity for black people. So my grandfather ended up actually working in, I believe it was Racine Steel Castings for 30 years. And he worked in a factory. And in fact, my grandfather lost part of his hand and part of his foot in an accident in the factory. On one of his hands, he had half of his pinky, 3/4 of his ring finger, and I believe it was the same on his toes. Um, which, I barely think about now. I'm sure as a kid it weirded me out, but it was just my grandfather, on one hand, didn't have all his fingers. But he was a hard worker. And for a time, my grandfather was also an alcoholic, as I've heard through stories. I never knew him that way. He had quit drinking years before I was even born. So I've heard stories about who he was when he was an alcoholic. I mean, my grandfather went through times where one particular story is my grandfather was one of those people that worked in the factory all week, gave my grandfather the money that she needed to pay all the bills, and then took the rest and went to bars. And so at one point, my grandfather, he came back drunk and he actually ended up threatening my grandmother with a rifle, and my Uncle Jim had to crawl out and get the cops. So I tell that contrast to show or to be transparent about my grandfather wasn't always the man that I came to know him as, and I know that. But I can only talk really about the man I knew without eliminating the bad of the man that I didn't. So, moving on to the grandfather that I knew. When I was growing up, Arzell was the person that would pick me up when I was sick, when my parents weren't available. Arzell and I would, every time I went to their apartment, it didn't matter. They had a McDonald's right across the parking lot, which is funny because I just remembered we still drove there every time because, he was old. He was in his 80s. No, mid to late 70s. He died when he was 86 in 2003. So my entire life, my grandparents were either in their 70s, 80s. Um, but yeah, we drove to the McDonald's across the parking lot, and he would always get a sausage egg McMuffin, which is what I get now. And it came in a blue wrapper back then. And that's back when the hash browns were brown, the casing around them. There's some old stuff for you to kind of date myself. Um, but he was always, I would feel sick or I would be tired, but my grandfather had a way of always making things warm and enjoyable. I don't know what it was about him. He just knew how to put you at ease somehow. And it's not that he was consciously trying, it just emanated from him, I think. And I felt that when I was younger, but I didn't understand it. Because when I was younger, I was very much a product of thinking that the mind was the important part of the body. Thinking that you need to develop your knowledge in textbook, that you need to know everything, that intelligence was the most important thing to have in life, which it is still important. It is. Book intelligence. Yes and no. Because what happens when you become too involved in book intelligence is that you start to devalue other intelligence. And I think that's subconsciously what I did with Arzell at points. Because I knew that he couldn't read past a certain point. And in some ways, I fell into the trap of thinking of my grandfather as being simple, as in being dumb. But it's funny. It was recently, maybe a month or two ago, when I was actually washing and waxing my car because, like, a certain old style of, things I am baroque. Thank you, community, for that joke. But no, I was sitting there and actually just doing it because I remember my grandfather took such pride in his cars. His car was immaculate. Always smelled the same kind of like minty, always spotless. Looked like he just bought it every time he picked me up. Never did Arzell Thompson have a dirty car. Ever. I mean, he kept his car Dexter clean. No, Arzell was not a serial killer, but he was that OCD about it. But I realized that my grandfather took great care of things. My grandfather never had a lot of money. He was never rich by any stretch. But my grandfather got nice things, nice clothes, nice shoes, and then he took care of them. My grandfather knew the value of the things he owned because they were all he could have, I think. And I think he applied the same thing to understanding the world. My grandfather, now that I think about it, had to deal with the reality of being a black man growing up in Mississippi in the first half of the 1900s, pre-civil rights movement, pre-everything else. I've heard stories about my grandfather going to the South and having to basically beg white people not to hurt or kill my Uncle Jim because of how he, being from the North, talked to a white person at a movie theater without addressing them with the proper quote-unquote respect. I've heard of my grandfather turning white as a ghost when my father walked out of the wrong bathroom in the South, going into the whites only and not the black. My father vowed never to go back to the South with my grandfather after that, and he didn't until we went for a family funeral in Mississippi when I was about 8. My grandfather grew up in a world that was never going to go his way. At least that was the implication at the time he was born. Again, this is before the Black Civil Rights Movement. The indication was that this was just life, that black people were going to be treated as less, that they would be held back from opportunities, that they wouldn't be as well educated, and their education wouldn't be taken as seriously. So my grandfather, as much as I think he was simple, as I grow older, I think that he was maybe the wisest person I know because I feel like he calculated. My grandfather saw the brick wall that is textbook knowledge. You could read every book out there. Hell, I was an English major. I can quote texts you've never heard of and that you'd never even care to hear of. And what did that get me? Damn near 30,000 in debt. Pursuing text knowledge, which you can tell that I have a Wisconsin accent sometimes with some things I say, like knowledge in college. So now I'm going to consciously try not to do that. So textbook knowledge is useful to a point. You need to know the rules of the world in order to function in it properly. And reading other people's perspectives gives you a better perspective of life and experience and just how humanity has formed over time. To a point. But text is cold, and knowledge is cold. Facts are cold. Facts don't have feeling. Truth does not have feeling. That's why whenever somebody reacts emotionally to facts or anything like that, okay, good for you. Feel what you feel, but it doesn't change it. Truth, facts. Highly unmoved by your emotions. My grandfather, no matter how he felt about the facts facing his circumstances, could not change them. And they wouldn't be changed for another 40 to 50 years after he was born, halfway through his life. So what do you do when you know that text knowledge, that books, that education isn't going to get you anywhere? You discover a different type of knowledge, which is the knowledge of people, of behavior. My grandfather was so likable that my father used to tell me as a kid, because I would go through the same thing with my father, because my father was also likable. People would stop my dad and talk to him in the grocery store, and me being a kid would sit there like, oh my God, please stop. And that was my father with Arzell, but even worse, because apparently Arzell just, even strangers left Arzell's presence feeling as if they had known him all their life. He was kind. And the best story to highlight that is one that's been passed down through my family because of how crazy it is, but also how much it demonstrates the character of my grandfather. So, my grandfather loved to drive around and he would go on car trips, And he used to pick up hitchhikers because, why not? That was just back in the day, it was fine for the most part. So, he picks up this hitchhiker and throughout the ride, he asks the guy, "Are you hungry?" So he senses the guy is. They stop, and he pays for this guy to have food, and he buys him some other things, and he takes such good care of him. He's so kind that when they finally get to the point that this man had said that he was going to get that he needed to go, he told my grandfather right before he got out of the car, "Listen, my whole plan when I got in this car was at some point I was going to kill you and take the car. But you were so nice to me, I couldn't bring myself to do it." And then he told him not to pick up any more hitchhikers, got out of the car, and my grandfather pulled away. The kindness of my grandfather's character saved his life. Not some textbook knowledge, not some video or training on, okay, if you're with a hitchhiker and you think they're about to try something, you do that. No, it was just his own natural kindness that saved him. Because my grandfather, I think, knew something that it would take me years of building castles out of the empty noise of knowledge, only to watch them crumble to figure out. He figured it out quite easily. People don't hurt people they like. People don't mistreat people who are kind to them. They can't. Because it would make them so incredibly cruel to do so. They quite literally have to sacrifice part of themselves to do something to you. Something harmful, something evil, when all you've done is offer kindness. And in that way, I think, when I look back at him now, I really miss my grandfather. In fact, I think I miss him more and more each day because I finally understand him. And I finally understand that simple doesn't mean unwise. My grandfather knew the world. He knew what was going on. He knew how bad things were, and he knew how the cards were stacked. And in all of it, as I knew him, he chose to be kind. I can't remember a single moment that my grandfather said a bitter word about anything. No, the memories that I have now is my grandfather's smile, walking to church and him sitting by the door to greet people, and he'd either slip me a mint or a $20 bill. The mints were disappointing. I remember the way that he used to smile at me at McDonald's after we had finished, and he would look at me and he'd say, "Well, is your gas tank full?" I remember my grandfather doing the jitterbug to the NBA Jam soundtrack while we were picking teams and stuff in our basement at our Racine home when I was a kid. I remember my grandfather's smile. I remember it because it's the same one that I think I wear now. Because when you look on the world with love and kindness, you can't help but smile. Yeah. There's plenty going on that that's cause for worry and alarm. There's plenty evils in our world that we need to fight against. Right now in America, we're so divided that we can't even talk right. We can't agree on facts. And some of us don't even want to seek truth because truth, again, is unfeeling. And sometimes it's horribly inconvenient to admit. But, but, so what? That's always been the story. We've always been on the verge of collapse. There's always been either another world power, something out in space, or ourselves trying to destroy us. So why is it recently that we've given up being kind? Why is it that the United States of America can't unite? In my opinion, it's because we have forgotten the lesson that my grandfather knew. Kindness saves you. Not not logic, not books. Your heart, your character, who you are to the people around you, how you treat them can make you the wealthiest person in the world. It can build up everyone. And all you have to do is just let go of trying to be the smartest man in the room and just try to be the kindest. Try to be the nicest. Try to be the one whose smile people remember long after you're gone. And that memory causes them to smile too. I love you, Arzell. And I miss you. And I hope to someday be really like you. To everyone who listened, thank you for listening to a story about my grandfather. And please, return for the next episode. I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but you know I'm going to talk about something. As always, take care of yourself. Be kind. Be loving. Treat others as you yourself need to be treated. Till next time. Bye.